The war between the ISA and Helghan was never a clean thing. It never pretended to be. From the moment Helghan was colonized and then abandoned, from the moment its people mutated under a poisoned sky and rose not in defeat but in fury, the conflict that followed carried the weight of something older than politics. It carried the weight of identity, of a people who had been told again and again by the broader arc of human civilization that they did not belong, and so they built an identity out of that rejection. They made discipline out of suffering. They made pride out of survival. Every Helghast soldier who stepped onto a battlefield did not merely fight for territory. He fought for the right to exist on his own terms. Sergeant Male Starn had been fighting since he was old enough to understand what the goggles meant. The red glow behind them was not theater. It was not intimidation alone, though it accomplished that well enough. It was a reminder, worn on the face, that the people of Helghan had adapted, that they breathed thin air and called it home, that they had taken the worst conditions a planet could offer and turned themselves into something harder, something leaner, something that did not flinch. Starn had served 9 years in the Helghast shock infantry. He had fought in urban corridors where the walls bled smoke and in open fields where ISA dropships turned the sky into fire. He had learned to read a battlefield the way other men read maps. Instinctively, immediately, without the need to think about it. The engagement at Orbital Station Kestrel was supposed to be a defensive operation. The ISA had pushed deep into Helghan-controlled space following the collapse of the Eastern Front, and what remained of the organized Helghast military was scattered, reactive, fighting in isolated pockets rather than in unified lines. Starn's unit had been tasked with holding a secondary relay node aboard a semi-functional orbital platform while Command worked out something resembling a counteroffensive. It was the kind of assignment that sounded simple until the ISA deployed their experimental energy disruption ordnance, because at that point nothing about it was simple anymore. The weapon detonated 3 levels above his position. He remembered the sound first, a low vibration that seemed to pass through his bones rather than his ears, and then the light, a pale violet luminescence that had no business existing in the spectrum of any conventional munition. He remembered thinking with the detached clarity that combat trains into a soldier over years of repetition that this was not standard ISA hardware. It was too quiet, too still at its edges. And then the hull around him simply stopped being where it was supposed to be, and Starn was somewhere else entirely. There was no transition he could account for, no tunnel of light, no sensation of movement or passage. One moment there was a burning orbital platform, the Helghast chain of command, the distant clatter of boots on metal grating. The next moment there was nothing. Not darkness, not silence, something worse than both, a pressure without direction. A sound like an ocean made entirely of static, and then solid ground beneath his boots, gritty and cold, and a sky above him that pulsed with colors that should not have existed in any atmosphere he had ever trained under. He took inventory before he did anything else. Helmet sealed, oxygen filter operational, pulse rifle full charge, 72 rounds remaining, 2 fragmentation grenades, combat knife, the basics of survival. He was breathing recycled air through the filter because the atmosphere around him, red as marginally breathable but laced with sulfur compounds and industrial particulate. The landscape matched nothing in his briefing files but felt deeply familiar in tone. Shattered industrial architecture, slag heaps taller than buildings. The skeleton of a processing tower collapsed against itself like a rusted spine. And in the distance, a settlement, low-slung and utilitarian, ringed with floodlights that swept the perimeter in slow mechanical arcs. He did not panic. Starn was not built for panic. He filed the impossibility of his situation into a compartment in his mind reserved for problems he could not yet solve, and then he focused on the problems he could. He was in unfamiliar territory. The settlement ahead was occupied and defended. The patrols he could see were armed and moving with disciplined intervals. The architecture bore every mark of heavy industrialization and long, grinding habitation. Someone had been here a very long time and had built entirely for function rather than comfort. That distinction mattered. Comfort was the architecture of people who believed things would eventually improve. Function was the architecture of people who had accepted that they never would. He circled wide of the perimeter lights and found a vantage point on a ridge of broken masonry. From there he watched the settlement for the better part of an hour. He counted patrol rotations. He identified the central command structure by the density of communication equipment on its exterior. He noted the uniforms, mass-produced and earth-toned, bearing insignia he did not recognize but whose design language he read immediately. This was a militarized population. The civilians moved differently from the soldiers, heads lower, steps more deliberate, performing the practiced invisibility of people who had learned long ago that drawing attention was rarely worth the cost. He had seen that walk before. He had seen it on Helghan in the districts where the industrial levy was heaviest, where the state's promises of unity had not yet filtered down to the people who needed them most. He had never been entirely comfortable with it. A soldier could believe fully in the ideology and still find certain mornings difficult to reconcile. But he had believed. He believed in Helghan's right to exist, in the dignity of its people, in the idea that strength forged through genuine suffering was more honest than strength inherited through privilege and comfort. He believed it still, even now, stranded on a world whose name he did not yet know. What he did not know was where he was or what had happened to the station, to his unit, to the war he had been fighting an hour ago. He filed those questions into the same compartment as the impossibility of his arrival, one problem at a time. He was a soldier without a homeworld, without a chain of command, without a flag. But he was alive. He was armed. And the settlement below was occupied by people living under conditions that looked, in every way that mattered, like a harder and older version of everything he already understood. That familiarity was not comfort, but it was a starting point. And for a Helghast soldier, a starting point was always enough. He entered the settlement before dawn, moving through a gap in the outer wall where the masonry had buckled from some old structural failure and never been properly repaired. The neglect told him something. Whoever governed this place allocated resources toward projection and enforcement, not maintenance. The streets inside were narrow and arranged without the kind of organic sprawl that came from people choosing how to live. These streets had been designed, laid out by someone who understood that narrow corridors were easier to control than wide avenues, that choke points were not an accident of geography, but a deliberate tool of population management. He moved through them quietly, cataloging everything, touching nothing. The propaganda arrived before he reached the first major intersection. It was printed on iron plates bolted directly into the walls, the paint worn but the imagery intact. A figure seated on a great throne, skeletal in proportion but radiating something that the artist had clearly intended as divine light. Beneath it, text in a script he could not read but whose layout and repetition he recognized as liturgical. This was not political propaganda in the sense he understood from Helghan. Helghast propaganda dealt in the language of strength, sacrifice, and national identity. It spoke to people as soldiers, as survivors, as a unified organism with a common enemy and a common purpose. This was something different. This spoke to people as subjects, as the grateful recipients of a mercy they had not earned and could not question. He studied 3 separate versions of the same imagery over the next 4 blocks. Each one emphasized the throne figure differently. Some plates showed it surrounded by warriors. Others showed it surrounded by what appeared to be saints or martyrs, figures with outstretched arms and expressions of ecstatic suffering. The common thread was submission. Every composition directed the eye downward, toward the viewer's place in the order of things, which was clearly meant to feel very small. Starn had been raised in a society that used imagery to inspire upward movement. These images were designed to hold people in place. He found a sheltered alcove near what appeared to be a distribution point for food rations and settled in to observe. The civilian population began moving through the streets as the false dawn lightened the sulphurous sky. They were thin, most of them, not starving but operating at the edge of adequate. They wore clothing that was practical and identical enough to suggest regulation but not quite uniform, as though the enforcement of conformity extended to material but stopped just short of full military standardization. They moved with their eyes forward, not downward in shame, but with a careful blankness, the expression of people who had learned that open curiosity was a liability. What struck him most was the silence. Not physical silence, the settlement was full of mechanical noise, grinding conveyors and pressurized steam pipes, and the distant rhythmic clang of something industrial being processed below street level. But human silence. No one spoke unless necessary. No one gathered at corners to talk. Children moved in supervised groups toward what looked like a processing facility of some kind, not a school in any sense he associated with education, more a place where the next generation of labor was prepared for the labor that would define the rest of their lives. He watched the children disappear through the facility doors and felt something he did not have a precise name for. Not pity exactly. He had been raised in conditions not unlike this, but something adjacent to it. He began to understand the institutional structure over the following hours. There were soldiers everywhere, but they operated in two distinct behavioral modes. The ones with heavier armor and iconographic markings on their pauldrons moved through the population with the ease of people who expected deference and received it without effort. The standard soldiers operated more like labor supervisors than warriors, directing work shifts and managing resource queues with the weary efficiency of men who had been doing the same thing for so long that the ideology behind it had long since become invisible to them. They were not true believers. They were functionaries. The true believers were different. He spotted 3 of them in the space of 2 hours. They wore robes over their armor rather than bare plate, and they carried a physical stillness that the other soldiers lacked. They moved through the civilian population like something out of place in it, not threatening exactly, but reminding everyone around them of a layer of authority that existed above the military and below whatever the throned figure represented. When they spoke, nearby civilians stopped what they were doing and bowed their heads, not from affection, from the specific kind of reflex that develops in people who have seen what happens when someone fails to perform it. He ran the comparison in his mind with the precision he would apply to a tactical assessment. Helghan ran on nationalism, on the idea that the people themselves were the source of their own worth, that Helghast identity was something built from the ground up through shared suffering and collective will. It was authoritarian, certainly, and the Helghast state had committed atrocities in the name of that identity. He had never been naive about that. But the ideology had a floor beneath which people remained people. What he was watching here had no such floor. Here, the people were not the source of worth. They were the recipients of it, conditionally, so long as they performed the correct devotions and produced the correct output, and never, under any circumstances, looked too long at the man on the throne and asked what exactly he was doing for them in return. He did not hate this place. He was not built for that kind of immediate moral reaction to an institution, but he understood it clearly. This was not a different version of Helghan. This was something older and more total. Helghan had been a nation forged in anger. This was an empire forged in obedience. The anger, at least, he recognized. The obedience was something he would need to think about for a long time before he decided what it meant. He had been in the settlement for 3 days when the lower hive caught fire. It was not a fire in any conventional sense. The smoke that rose from the lower sectors before the alarm sounded was the wrong color, a deep burgundy laced with something that shimmered at its edges, and the screaming that accompanied it carried a frequency that did not belong to ordinary human panic. It carried something ecstatic underneath it, something that made the hair along the back of his neck rise in a way that no ISA ambush had ever managed. He was on the street when it began. He was already moving before any of the soldiers around him had finished processing what they were hearing. He had fought religious extremism before, in the sense that he had fought ISA units who believed their cause was righteous with the same fervor that others applied to Scripture. But that was political conviction wearing the clothing of faith. What poured out of the lower hive entrance into the street before him was something that had abandoned the clothing entirely and was operating on the raw current underneath. They were human in shape. Some of them were still wearing the same regulated clothing as the civilian population, which made them worse to look at in certain ways, because the gap between what they had been and what they were now was visible in the fabric. They moved in clusters rather than lines, and they were armed with a mixture of improvised weapons and standard issue items taken from soldiers they had clearly already killed, because 3 uniformed bodies lay at the top of the hive entrance stairs. Starn did not deliberate. He stepped into a recessed doorway, brought his pulse rifle to his shoulder, and began engaging targets with the systematic precision of a man who had been doing this for nearly a decade. Short, controlled bursts. Target identification before each engagement. No wasted rounds. He moved from the doorway after the first volley, because staying stationary after firing was how soldiers died in urban environments, and shifted to a secondary position behind an overturned cargo vehicle 40 meters to his left. From there, he had a clean sightline down the corridor the cultists were using as their primary axis of movement, and he began working through them methodically. Imperial guardsmen arrived from the eastern checkpoint in good order, about 12 of them, moving in a formation that spoke of trained infantry rather than garrison regulars. They entered the street from the opposite end and caught the cultist column between 2 points of fire. Starn recognized the tactical shape immediately and adjusted his own fire to cover the flanks while the guardsmen managed the center. It was a natural distribution. Neither side had communicated it. It simply happened because both sides were looking at the same problem from the perspective of people who understood how infantry problems got solved. The engagement lasted 11 minutes. He counted. By the end of it, 43 cultists were down. 3 guardsmen were wounded. The shimmering smoke from the lower hive was thinning but not gone, which meant the source of it had not been addressed yet, only the first wave of whatever the source had produced. The guardsman sergeant, a compact man with a jaw like a buttress, was moving among his unit checking casualties when he glanced toward the far end of the street and saw Starn standing in the open, pulse rifle lowered, watching. There was a long pause. The sergeant said something to the man beside him, quiet enough that Starn could not hear it at the distance. Then he raised a hand in a gesture that might have been acknowledgement or might have been something else entirely. Starn did not move. He stood in the acrid smoke for another few seconds, then turned and walked back into the alley from which he had emerged. He heard them talking as he left. He could not decode the language entirely. His familiarity with the local dialect was still rough, but he caught the tenor of it. Uncertainty, not hostility, not yet. The kind of uncertainty that comes when something useful and unexplained appears in a moment of crisis and then disappears before anyone can categorize it. He knew the tenor well. He had been on the other side of it once, early in his service, when his unit had secured a bridge crossing ahead of their assigned timeline and officers reviewing the aftermath had not known whether to praise them or investigate them. Over the following days, something shifted in the way the settlement soldiers moved through the sectors. Not dramatically, not in any way that would constitute a formal change of posture. But the peripheral awareness directed toward the outer districts, the one Starn had been using as his operational area, increased noticeably. More eyes toward the rubble lines. More pauses at corner junctions where a soldier would briefly scan a lane he might previously have passed without thought. They were looking for something they could not name. He was aware of being looked for and found a distant satisfaction in not being found. The rumors reached him secondhand through overheard conversations at the settlement's outer distribution points, where civilians collected rations and occasionally spoke to each other in the compressed, careful way of people who were not sure which of their neighbors was listening on behalf of authority. A red-eyed soldier, moving in the smoke, firing without orders. Some of the versions were more elaborate than the facts warranted, as rumors always were, stitched together from half-glimpsed details and the natural human instinct to make a coherent story out of fragments. But the core of each version was consistent. A figure in dark armor with glowing red optical units had appeared in the lower corridor engagement and then vanished. No name, no affiliation, no explanation. He filed the rumors the way he filed everything, into the appropriate compartment. A myth forming around him was neither useful nor dangerous yet. It was simply information, and information was always worth keeping. The report that reached Inquisitor Thessaly Vor took 11 days to move through the layers of Imperial bureaucracy between the mining world of Karathos Primus and the nearest active inquisitorial cell. It arrived stripped of most of its original specificity through the passage of successive transcription and summary, which was the standard fate of reports that originated with line infantry and were considered too minor for priority routing. By the time it reached Vor, it described only a non-registered armored combatant operating in the lower sectors of Hive Noctis, bearing unidentified optical enhancements and unknown weaponry, who had participated in suppressing a minor chaos cult uprising before disappearing without making contact with Imperial command. The Inquisitor read it twice. The details that remained after the layers of compression were few, but they were arranged in a way that she found interesting. Unknown weaponry, unknown armor pattern, optical enhancement rather than augmetic replacement. The last detail was the one that snagged her attention most cleanly. Imperial soldiers who wore helmets with vision enhancement typically wore sanctioned patterns produced by Mechanicus-approved forges, and those patterns were documented and recognizable to anyone with access to standard identification files. Whatever this soldier had been wearing did not match any registered pattern. That either meant the witness description was inaccurate, which was common, or it meant the armor had come from somewhere entirely outside the registered supply chain, which was interesting. She forwarded the report to her personal Mechanicus liaison with a request for analysis of what the witnesses described as a pulse weapon with no visible propellant signature. She did not yet assign it formal inquisitorial priority. She marked it with a notation she had developed over 20 years of investigation, possibly relevant. The Adeptus Mechanicus analyzed the weapon description and returned a formal assessment within 4 days. The assessment was in the measured language of a magos who had trained himself to write without emotion but could not entirely eliminate it, quietly astonished. The energy profile described by guardsman witnesses was inconsistent with standard loss weapon discharge. It was also inconsistent with plasma weapon discharge, which left a residual thermal signature recognizable to any field medic who had treated plasma burns. The cultist casualties recovered from the engagement site showed wound channels consistent with a high-velocity focused energy discharge of a type that the Magos identified as theoretically possible, but practically unattested in any current Imperial arms catalog. The weapon that made those wounds did not exist in any register the Mechanicus maintained, and the Adeptus Mechanicus maintained extremely thorough registers. On Carathos Primus itself, the soldier in question had not become easier to locate. The local garrison commander, a prefect named Arlen Soth, had dispatched 2 additional patrol circuits through the outer districts following the cult engagement without result. His report to the planetary governor described the unknown soldier with the carefully understated language of a military man who was not certain whether he was describing a resource or a problem. It noted that the engagement outcome had been favorable and that the unknown combatant's fire discipline had been consistent with advanced infantry training. It also noted that no further contact had been made and that requests broadcast on open frequency channels had gone unanswered. Starn had heard the broadcasts. His helmet's audio systems translated the language imperfectly but well enough for him to grasp their intent. They were asking him to identify himself and present himself at the garrison for assessment. He had considered it once for approximately 40 seconds and then set the consideration aside. He had no documentation. He had no identification within any system this civilization used. He was carrying weapons they had already noted as anomalous, and he was wearing armor they could not categorize. Walking into a garrison under those conditions, in a society that he had already assessed as operating on deep institutional suspicion of anything unregistered, was not a survivable proposition. He continued to operate in the outer districts instead, which was where the problems continued to accumulate. The cult uprising in the lower hive had not been fully suppressed by the first engagement. The source of the shimmering smoke, which he eventually identified through careful proximity observation as a ritual site dug into the underfoundations of the outer processing corridor, was still active and still producing the kind of effects on nearby populations that preceded further violence. He mapped it over 2 days. He noted the entry points, the guard rotations the cultists had established around it, and the approximate count of dedicated personnel versus recent converts. He was beginning to understand gradually that the weapons he carried were operating in conditions they had not been designed for. The pulse rifle functioned normally against human targets. Against the things that occasionally emerged from deeper in the cult's tunnels, the results were less consistent. He had expended 11 rounds against one entity that the cultists were clearly treating as an object of reverence, and he had not killed it cleanly. He had damaged it. He had driven it back. But it had not stopped in the way that a round through the right anatomical location reliably stopped a human or a Helghast. Something about the physics of this galaxy was operating on different principles than the ones his training had been built around, and he was filing new data points every day without yet having enough of them to build a reliable model. He began adapting. He found a scrap metal workshop in the outer district, abandoned by its operator, which contained enough raw materials and functional tools for basic fabrication work. Over the following week, he constructed improvised explosive devices using the frag grenade casings he carried as templates. He salvaged components from disabled patrol equipment. He modified the pulse rifle's power cell to run hotter, accepting reduced lifespan in exchange for increased output against targets that proved resistant to standard charge. A Helghast soldier in the field adapted. That was not unique to this galaxy. That was simply what soldiers did when supply lines did not reach them. Inquisitor Vor received the second report from Karathos Primus on the 22nd day. This one had been granted priority routing because the garrison commander had used the phrase unregistered combatant of unknown origin 3 times in the same document, and unregistered was a word that moved quickly through Imperial bureaucratic filters. She read it with the same measured attention she brought to everything, and when she finished, she placed the report beside the first one and spent a long moment looking at both of them together. She had served the Inquisition for 31 years. She had encountered, in that time, soldiers from every recognized branch of the Imperial military and a significant number of irregular forces operating in the gray space between sanctioned and unsanctioned. She had also encountered things that came through the warp wearing various kinds of disguise. She had learned to tell the difference between the two categories by their behavior, because behavior was harder to fabricate than appearance. Whatever was operating on Karathos Primus was showing consistent behavior. It engaged Chaos-affiliated targets. It avoided Imperial contact. It did not harm civilians. It fought with demonstrable discipline. She noted all of these things without yet reaching a conclusion, because reaching conclusions before sufficient evidence accumulated was how Inquisitors made fatal mistakes. She marked the file, active monitoring required. The orcs came from the dark side of the moon. That was how the garrison commander described it in his initial alarm transmission, and while the phrasing was technically imprecise, it captured the experiential reality of the situation well enough. The first detection of the WAOG came from the orbital monitoring station at approximately 200,000 kilometers, which gave Karathos Primus less than 6 hours to prepare a defense posture for a ground assault. In 6 hours, the garrison could do several things. It could not do nearly enough of them. Starn was in the outer district when the sirens began. He had never heard orcs before. He had heard about them, in the sense that he had spent enough time listening to the population of Karathos Primus to piece together a rough vocabulary, and enough of that vocabulary involved their names spoken in a particular register, to understand that they represented a category of threat distinct from the chaos activity he had been dealing with. But description and encounter were different things, and when the first orc drop pod punched through the settlement's outer wall section 300 meters to his north, the sound it made on impact was not like anything his prior combat experience had prepared him for. He joined the defense by instinct and by practicality. He had no Helghast unit to account for, no chain of command to answer to, and no ideological stake in the survival of the Imperial settlement that he was willing to identify as genuine loyalty. But there were people in those corridors, and they were going to die in very large numbers, very quickly if the initial breach was not contained, and the calculus of that was simple enough that ideology was not required to reach the correct conclusion. He moved toward the breach. What he found there was a different kind of war than he had known. In the Helghan ISA conflict, both sides had been human in the broadest sense, constrained by human logistics, human psychology, and human institutional limitations. The ISA had superior equipment and Helghan had superior motivation, and the outcome of individual engagements depended on which of those two factors dominated in a given situation. There had been a legibility to it. A soldier could understand the opponent's objectives and predict the opponent's behavior with reasonable accuracy, because the opponent was operating from recognizable human frameworks. Orcs did not operate from recognizable human frameworks. They operated from something that Starn could only describe, to himself and with considerable reluctance, as joy. Not the performance of joy. Actual joy. The orcs breaching the wall were not fighting because they had been ordered to. Not fighting to reclaim something taken from them. Not fighting because an ideology demanded it. They were fighting because fighting was, for them, the primary mode of being alive. He had faced soldiers who enjoyed violence before. This was different. This was something so far outside the framework of his training that he had to actively resist the instinct to find rational motivations where none existed. He fought for 4 hours in the breach sector alongside guardsmen who had been doing this long enough to have developed a specific and very grim relationship with it. They did not fight with Helghast intensity, that cold, focused fury born from personal national identity. They fought with something that took him longer to identify correctly. They fought with endurance, with the settled, practiced quality of people who had accepted that the thing they were doing today was the same thing they would be doing tomorrow and the week after that. This was not heroism in the traditional sense. This was maintenance. The defense of Karathos Primus against this orc incursion was not the climax of anything. It was simply the current item on a list that had no final entry. He killed orcs efficiently. His pulse rifle required the modified higher output setting to achieve reliable stopping power, and he burned through power cells faster than he preferred. He used his grenades twice, once to collapse a corridor section that 3 orcs were using as a charge lane, and once on a larger specimen that had broken through the secondary barricade and was systematically dismantling the nearest fire team. The combat knife came out on 2 occasions. He had not used a blade in close combat since a tunnel engagement on Helghan's northern processing complex, and the muscle memory for it was still intact in the way that the body preserved things it had been trained thoroughly enough to hold. What troubled him was not the physical scale of it. He could adapt a physical scale. What troubled him in the hours after the breach was sealed and he withdrew to a collapsed service corridor to assess his ammunition state and think, was the strategic futility of what he had participated in. On Helghan, every battle had a political shape, a contested resource, a defensive line, a tactical objective with a clear relationship to the broader war's outcome. Victories accumulated towards something, even when the something was only survival, and even when survival itself was grinding and brutal. There was a direction to it. Here there was no direction. The garrison commander, speaking over the communication channel that Starn had quietly patched into through a salvaged relay unit, described the orc incursion as a splinter element of a WAG that had been active in this subsector for 60 years. 60 years. He sat with that number for a while. In 60 years of conflict on Helghan, entire political systems had risen and fractured and been rebuilt. The ISA conflict itself had been measured in years with the assumption, on both sides, that it would eventually resolve into some kind of decisive outcome. A WAG that had been running for 60 years as a splinter element of something larger was not a war in any sense. His training had given him the framework to process. It was a condition, a permanent environmental feature of this galaxy, like sulfur in the atmosphere or cold in the dark. He thought about what the guard sergeant had said to a younger soldier during the breach engagement, not to Starn, but within earshot, in the tone that experienced soldiers use when they are trying to prepare someone for a truth rather than comfort them against it. The sergeant had said, "You do not win this war. You hold it." The young soldier had asked what the difference was. The sergeant had not answered, because the breach had opened again at that moment, and the answer had been delivered by the situation rather than by words. Starn understood the answer. He had understood it the moment the old sergeant declined to articulate it. Holding was not winning. Holding was something you did when winning was not available. And in a galaxy where the enemy never ran out, never stopped, never reached a point where it acknowledged defeat and withdrew from the equation, holding was not a strategy. It was a posture, a way of existing in the presence of something that would outlast you. For the first time since the warp rift had deposited him on this world, Starn felt something he had not felt since very early in his service, before the ideology had hardened fully around his thinking and given the suffering a purpose it could bear. He felt the beginning of a question he was not certain he wanted to finish asking. They arrived on the 7th day of the orc incursion, which was the day the outer wall's eastern section finally failed completely, and the garrison's casualty rate crossed the threshold that the commander had previously identified as the point at which conventional defense became no longer viable. The Thunderhawk came in low and without ceremony, its hull scorched from re-entry, its engines cutting to minimum thrust 100 meters above the primary courtyard, in a landing maneuver that suggested the pilot considered grace and inefficiency. It set down hard and the ramp opened before the dust from the impact had settled. They were larger than the human imagination prepared for them to be, even in the abstract. Starn had heard the guardsmen speak of them in the reverent shorthand of men who had fought alongside them before and survived it and were not yet done being grateful. He had assembled a rough conceptual image from those overheard descriptions. The reality exceeded it by a margin that he noted without sentiment but also without complete neutrality. These were human beings in the original sense, built from human stock and then taken apart and rebuilt according to a different set of specifications entirely. 7 of them came down the ramp, each moving with the kind of precision that indicated the armor was not a constraint on their movement, but an extension of it. They had been wearing it long enough that it had become part of how they thought about the space their bodies occupied. He observed them for the first 20 minutes from a position in the upper gallery of the depot where he had been maintaining a fire line. They integrated with the existing defense with the efficiency of forces that had done this in every variation and permutation across 1,000 different engagements. The guardsmen around them straightened almost involuntarily, not from commanded discipline but from the automatic recalibration of self-assessment that occurs when something significantly better at your job appears in your immediate vicinity. He recognized that too. He had been on the receiving end of it once, when a Helghast elite unit had rotated through his sector during a campaign, and he had watched his own soldiers adjust their posture without being told to. The Space Marines took the Eastern Breach within 23 minutes. He timed them. They did it in a way that was not spectacular in the performative sense. There was no grand charge, no heroic speech, no theatrical display of capability. They moved through the breach sector in a coordinated pattern that eliminated a tactical problem at the root, rather than engaging it at its current manifestation, which was the breach itself. They located the point of Orc command concentration, the largest and most heavily armed Orc present, and they killed it with focused collective violence before the Orc mass could process what was happening at its center. Then they held the position while the guardsmen re-established the line behind them. It was excellent work. He acknowledged that to himself without reservation, because a Helghast soldier who could not recognize quality in an enemy was a soldier who would eventually be killed by underestimating that quality, and the same principle applied to anyone who was not explicitly an ally. Whether these warriors were allies, enemies, or simply a separate force operating in the same space was a question he had not yet resolved. He intended to resolve it carefully and from a distance. The resolution became less distant when the Space Marine sergeant turned and looked directly at his position in the upper gallery. He had been careful. He had maintained consistent cover, moved slowly enough to avoid motion detection, and kept his optical units dim rather than active during the engagement to minimize reflected light. The sergeant found him anyway, which meant either the armor carried sensors beyond his current ability to account for, or the sergeant was simply very good at detecting the presence of other trained combatants in a space. Both possibilities were worth understanding. They held eye contact across roughly 30 meters of smoke-filled depot interior for a period of time that Starn measured at approximately 8 seconds. The sergeant did not raise a weapon. He did not speak into a communication channel. He looked, assessed, and then turned back to the situation at hand without making any further acknowledgement of what he had seen. That was a communication in itself. It said, "I see you. I have noted you. I have decided for the moment that you are not the priority." It was precisely the kind of acknowledgement one professional extended to another when circumstances required both of them to deal with something more immediate than each other. He felt something in that exchange that he would not have predicted feeling. Not relief. Something closer to recognition. These were soldiers built for a purpose so total that they had become the purpose rather than simply serving it. They did not question the war. They had been constructed not to question it. And looking at them, seeing the absolute absence of internal conflict in the way they moved and engaged and processed the battlefield, he understood something about the Helghast ideal that he had never fully articulated before. Helghan had wanted to build this. Had wanted to produce soldiers for whom the war and the identity and the sacrifice were not things that required constant renewal of belief, because the belief had been integrated into the architecture of the person from the beginning. He had been made through suffering into something approaching that ideal. They had been made through engineering into something that exceeded it. The difference between him and them was not discipline. It was not competence or commitment or willingness to endure. The difference was doubt. He still carried it. In a galaxy this old and this dark, he was beginning to think that might be the more honest way to fight. The second orc wave came 3 weeks after the first was repelled. He did not find this surprising. The garrison commander found it demoralizing, which was a different response, but also Starn was beginning to understand, an entirely rational one given how long the man had been here. He had been stationed on Karathos Primus for 11 years. In 11 years, the orc presence in the subsector had neither grown significantly nor diminished significantly. It had maintained itself at a level that required constant military response without ever escalating into the kind of existential crisis that would justify the reallocation of larger imperial resources. It was, in the operational language of a bureaucracy managing a galaxy, an acceptable level of threat. He thought about that phrase for a long time after he overheard the garrison commander use it in a communication with the subsector administrative body. An acceptable level of threat. On Helghan, threat had never been accepted. It had been resisted. That was the distinction between survival culture and institutional culture. Survival culture rejected the premise of acceptable suffering because the people doing the suffering were the same people defining what was acceptable. Institutional culture managed the suffering from a sufficient distance that the management could be called acceptable without the people applying that term being personally exposed to the thing they were describing. The second orc wave was repelled. The third wave arrived 5 weeks after that. He fought in all three, not from loyalty to the settlement's garrison or to the imperial institution it served, but because the alternative was allowing a concentration of genuinely dangerous violence to overrun a civilian population that had no means of defending itself. This was not ideology. This was arithmetic. He performed the arithmetic each time and reached the same result and acted accordingly. But something was accumulating in the repetition. Not fatigue in the physical sense, his body was conditioned to sustain this level of operational tempo without significant degradation. Something else. Something that operated in the part of him that had been trained to believe that sacrifice purchased something. Helghast soldiers died for Helghan. There was grief in that, and the grief was specific and heavy, but it was attached to something real. The Helghast who died in the ISA conflict died for an identity, for a world, for a people who would remember them and carry the weight of that memory as both burden and fuel. The soldiers dying on Karathos Primus died for a line that would be in the same place next year. The same line, the same enemy, the same acceptable level of threat. He began to do something he had not done since his earliest years in the infantry, before discipline had given him the tools to stop himself. He began to calculate forward, not tactically in terms of immediate engagement projection, but philosophically in terms of what the current trajectory extended into. If the orc incursions had been running for 60 years as a splinter element, and the main WOG had been active for longer, and if other garrison worlds across the subsector were engaged in parallel variations of the same defense cycle, and if the chaos cult activity he had suppressed on his arrival was not an isolated phenomenon but one expression of a galaxy-wide corruption that the Imperial institution was also managing at an acceptable level, then what, precisely, was the terminal state of all of this? Where did it end? He sat with the question in the ruins of the outer district on a night when the sky was clear enough, between the pollution and the orbital debris, to see a thin scatter of stars. He had not looked at stars with philosophical intent since he was a young soldier on his first deployment, before the ideology had closed around him fully and given the darkness a different meaning. Now he looked at them and thought about scale. In the Helghan conflict, scale had been measured in political units. In the Helghast national project, a measurable thing had been at stake. Victory, in the specific sense of a recognized Helghast sovereignty and an end to the ISA's campaigns against his people, had been conceivable even when it was not achievable. It had been a thing that could be named and pointed to. The scale of this galaxy made that kind of naming impossible. The Imperium fought on 10,000 fronts simultaneously. Chaos was not an enemy that could be defeated in the sense of being destroyed, because it did not originate from a place that could be destroyed. It originated from somewhere inside the fundamental nature of conscious beings who experienced emotion, and as long as such beings existed and felt despair or anger or pride or grief, the chaos that fed on those things would exist too. The orcs reproduced from spores and could repopulate a devastated war zone in decades. The Tyranids, which he had heard about in fractured overheard briefings but not yet encountered, were apparently a galaxy-spanning biological force that adapted to every countermeasure applied against it. He was a soldier from a civilization that had lasted in its current form perhaps 2 centuries. He was standing inside a civilization that had been fighting the same wars for 10,000 years and had not won any of them decisively. He did not break under this realization. He was not built for breaking. But something in his internal architecture shifted quietly, in the way that load-bearing elements shift when the weight they carry exceeds what the original design anticipated. He had always known that war ended eventually. He had always believed, even in the darkest parts of the Helghan conflict, that there was a shape to it, a beginning and a possible end, and that the sacrifices made along its length were purchasing something real. He was no longer certain that belief could be imported into this galaxy, because this galaxy did not appear to operate on those terms. He could not find the end of the war he was standing inside. He could not find its purpose in the sense of a purpose that had a conceivable completion. He could only find its duration, which appeared to be indefinite, and its scale, which appeared to be total. For the first time since arriving in this galaxy, he felt something that he recognized with great reluctance as the early stages of despair. He sat in the outer district ruins for the better part of a night working through the problem. He was not a philosopher. He had not been trained in philosophy and did not have the temperament for the kind of abstract contemplation that proceeded without practical application. But he was a strategist, in the specific infantry sense of a man who could look at a situation, identify what was actually achievable within its constraints, and build a functional course of action from that identification rather than from what he wished were achievable. The despair he had felt in the face of this galaxy's eternal war was real. He was not going to pretend otherwise. But despair was not a plan. And he had never in his life operated without a plan for longer than was absolutely necessary. The problem as he defined it was this: he could not win the galaxy's war. That was not a failure of will or capability. It was a factual assessment of scale and mathematics. A single Helghast soldier, even a highly trained and well-equipped one, could not resolve the threat of chaos or the orc or any of the other existential forces the Imperium was perpetually managing. He could participate in the galaxy's war at the margins, adding his firepower to engagements he happened to be present for, and he could do this effectively. But the effective margin he contributed would be absorbed by the scale of the conflict without leaving a measurable trace. The war would continue precisely as it had before him, and would continue precisely as it had after him, and the sum of his participation would be statistically invisible. That was not, however, the only way to frame the question. The galaxy's war was vast and eternal. The situation in Hive Noctis was specific and local. The cult tunnels beneath the outer processing corridor were a definable problem with a definable solution. The orc breach in the eastern wall was a tactical challenge that could be engaged and resolved within a finite operational time frame. The civilian sectors he had been watching, the same sectors whose population moved with the careful blankness of people living under total institutional management, faced threats that were immediate and measurable. Those people were not abstractions. They were not statistics. They were the same kind of people who had populated the industrial districts of Helghan. People who had not chosen the conditions of their lives, but were living inside those conditions as fully and as stubbornly as they were capable of, and who would die unnecessarily if the specific and local threats surrounding them were allowed to mature without opposition. He could address specific and local threats. That was within the actual scope of what he was and what he could do. He could not save the Imperium. He could not resolve the galaxy's endless war. He could not even, in any meaningful sense, improve the institutional structures that made life on Karathos Primus what it was, because those structures were embedded in something 10,000 years old and did not respond to the influence of a single soldier operating without portfolio. But he could hold a breach. He could collapse a cult ritual site. He could eliminate the chaos presence in the outer district before it expanded into the lower Hive sectors where 30,000 civilians worked the night shift. He made a decision, not a dramatic one, not the kind of decision that gets recorded in history or inscribed on monuments. A practical one reached through practical reasoning. In the ruins of an outer district on a mining world at the edge of a subsector nobody important was watching. He would not join the Imperium. He had no interest in their theology and no capacity for the submission it required. He would not rebel against it because rebellion required a counter-ideology, a vision of something better, and a willingness to burn the existing structure down to build toward it. And he did not have the information or the standing in this galaxy to determine whether the Imperium, for all its ugliness, was better or worse than the alternative. He would not seek a way home, at least not as a primary objective, because seeking a way home while ignoring the immediate situation was the kind of choice that produced clean hands and an empty conscience. He was not interested in either. He would fight the wars that could be fought and won within the scope of what he was. He would defend the civilian sectors because they could be defended. He would destroy the cult infrastructure because it could be destroyed. He would help the guard hold the line when the orcs came because the line could be held, even if holding it did not change the larger equation. He would do these things not in the name of the Emperor, whose nature he remained deeply skeptical of, and not in the name of Helghan, which was gone from him in a way that might be permanent, and not in the name of any ideology that this galaxy might try to press into the space his old one had occupied. He would do them because they were the right scale of problem for the tools he had, and because soldiers who refused to engage problems at the right scale because the larger scale was too discouraging were not soldiers at all. They were spectators. He began the next morning by returning to the Outer District workshop. He repaired his equipment, recalibrated the pulse rifle's power cell to a sustainable output level now that he was no longer facing orc-grade targets daily, and took inventory of his remaining materials. He had enough to maintain operational tempo for approximately 3 weeks without resupply, after which he would need to either fabricate replacement components from available salvage or adapt to locally available weapons. The latter was not ideal but was not unacceptable. Helghast infantry had always been adaptable. That had never been conditional on access to Helghast supply lines. He marked the cult tunnel network on the rough map he had been building since his arrival, assigned a priority order to the entry points based on activity patterns he had observed, and began planning. Not the plan of a man who believed he was saving the galaxy. The plan of a soldier who had identified a finite problem, assessed the available resources, and accepted the work. That was enough. For a Helghast, it had always been enough. The reports accumulated over months, then years. On Carathos Primus, the garrison's informal record-keeping included a category that the soldiers had invented themselves, one that did not appear in any official Imperial documentation, because the official Imperial documentation had no mechanism for recording the activities of a combatant who refused to be classified. They called the category the Red Eyes account. It was not formally maintained. It was written in the margins of actual reports, in the rest spaces between documented engagements, in the kind of language soldiers use when they are recording something real that the official record has decided is not worth acknowledging. 14 cult ritual sites cleared in the Outer District. 3 orc flanking incursions collapsed before they reached the civilian sectors. A chaos-corrupted overseer, one who had survived 4 separate inquisitorial investigations by virtue of being too deep within the bureaucratic infrastructure to easily remove, found dead in his hab level with a single pulse wound through the chest. No witness, no perpetrator, just a result. The Inquisitor's file on the Red Eyes account grew alongside the garrison record. Thessaly Vor had upgraded the classification 3 times over 2 years, moving it from possibly relevant through active monitoring required to designated watch priority. She had not upgraded it further, had not moved it into active threat or active pursuit, because the behavioral profile remained consistent and the consistency was itself information. Whatever this entity was, it had defined its own parameters and was operating inside them with remarkable discipline. It was not expanding its activity. It was not recruiting. It was not building toward anything she could identify as an agenda. It was simply present and persistent and targeting the kinds of problems that she, if she were honest with herself in the privacy of her own analysis, found difficult to object to on principle even if she found them deeply difficult to accept on procedural grounds. On a dozen other worlds, similar reports. Not the same soldier perhaps. She could not confirm that the red-eyed armored figure operating in the Serbil subsector was the same one who had appeared on Drachas IV or in the transit corridors of Hive Mentaris. The reports were too fragmented, too filtered through witnesses of varying reliability, too separated by the vast distances of the Imperium's geography. But the behavioral signature was the same, a figure of unknown affiliation with unregistered armor and anomalous weaponry, appearing in the proximity of unresolvable local threats, engaging those threats with disciplined and effective violence, and then disappearing before Imperial authority could establish contact, never claiming credit, never seeking recognition, never doing anything that could be identified as the behavior of someone with a long-term agenda. The Imperium had no framework for that. The Imperium's framework divided the galaxy's inhabitants into categories that were ultimately binary, those who served the Emperor and those who did not. The binary was not simple in its application. There were enormous institutional gradations within each category. But the fundamental architecture of Imperial thinking required that everything be placed on one side of the line or the other. Something that refused the binary was not neutral in Imperial terms. It was unresolved. And in the Imperium's 10,000 years of experience, unresolved things had a statistical tendency to resolve themselves in ways that were dangerous. So the Inquisition watched, and the Red Eyes account continued to grow, and the line between watched and hunted remained undrawn. Starn did not think about the line. He thought about the work. 2 years on this world had given him a functional language, a reliable understanding of the local power structures, and a set of operational contacts in the civilian population who provided him with information not out of ideology, but out of the simple, human recognition that he was the only force in their vicinity that consistently solved the problems that directly affected their survival. They did not know what he was. He had not explained himself to them, and they had not asked, because asking was its own kind of risk in a world where information shared upward moved faster than information shared sideways. They knew only that when the cult pressed too close to the residential corridors, the pressure eventually stopped. They credited their own endurance with this because the alternative was crediting something they could not explain, and unexplained things in the Imperium tended to attract the wrong kind of attention. You would not have wanted credit anyway. Credit was not the point. The point was the work. The 40,000 residents of the Outer District, who still moved with their eyes forward and their expressions carefully blank, were alive in a way they would not have been without the work. Not thriving. Not free in any sense that he could point to and call freedom. But alive and intact and still capable of the small resistances that people maintain when they are not destroyed, the quiet conversations, the shared meals held slightly longer than efficiency required, the songs sung low enough that they registered as ambient noise to anyone listening for the content of them. These were not revolutionary acts. They were not acts of rebellion or hope or transformation. They were simply the acts of people maintaining their own humanity at the exact threshold below which the institution around them would notice and intervene. He understood that threshold. He had always understood it. He had been raised on a world defined by it. The galaxy would not change because of him. He knew that. He had known it since the night in the ruins when he had reached through the despair and found the arithmetic and built a plan on its foundation. He was not a turning point. He was not a harbinger. He was not a symbol of anything. He was one soldier from a dead civilization, carrying weapons no one in this galaxy had registered, fighting wars he had chosen on the scale he could fight them, in the service of a code that belonged to him personally and to nothing else. The Imperium had not claimed him. He had not claimed the Imperium. Between the two of them, the galaxy continued exactly as it had always continued, vast and grinding and indifferent and full of the endless noise of a species that had been at war with everything, including itself, for longer than most civilizations lasted. But in the outer district of a mining world at the edge of a subsector nobody important was watching, the Red Eyes account continued. The civilians survived who might not have. The cults burned who might have spread. The line held who might have broken. Not everywhere. Not across the galaxy. Just here. Just this. A soldier without a homeworld, enduring in the grim darkness because endurance was what he had been made for. And because in a universe where victory was not available, endurance was the only honest thing left to offer. He offered it without ceremony, without expectation. without end.